Okay, so getting back to the article about Abdias, today, as this movement continues to grow and is able to reach a wider following through the use of the internet, the re-release of this classic book, again, The Genocide of the Black Brazilian, comes at a perfect time. Anyone interested in the situation of Black Brazilians should add this book to their collection. And if you're just now getting into the Brazil thing, like I did several years ago, this book is a perfect reason to learn or improve your Portuguese. So when this book was re-released, this was the cover that they chose. All right, The Genocide of the Black Brazilian, the process of a masked racism. So, book by Abdias do Nascimento that confronted the racial democracy theory re-released. New edition of The Genocide of the Black Brazilian is a registration of the struggle of its author to denounce racism in Brazil. Again, the whole shtick of the Brazilian government was to cover up and deny that racism existed in Brazil. In 1977, okay, this article is by Bolivar Torres is pronounced. In 1977, Abdias do Nascimento was in Lagos, Nigeria, ready to present a combative essay at the colloquium of the Second World Festival of Black Arts and Culture that sought to dismantle a theory widely diffused in Brazilian culture and which had been propagated throughout the world by the military dictatorship at that time, that the nation lived in a tranquil racial harmony and that Blacks were less excluded here than in apartheid South Africa or in certain southern states of the United States. But the Brazilian government prevented the playwright and activist from representing the country in the event, replacing him with Professor Fernando A. Mourão, who defended opposing theories. So basically, you got Nascimento, who wanted to expose the truth, and another professor that would go and, told the line of what the government, how the government wanted Brazil to be presented outside of the country. The text, however, was published by a mimeograph by the University of Ife in Nigeria, where Nascimento taught as a visiting professor, and then distributed by the author himself to the participants in the colloquium, which presented up to then a previously unknown view of the country. Okay, so listen to what that's saying there. It's just basically saying that outside of Brazil, and even within Brazil, people didn't understand the racial situation. People were led to believe that Brazil had a racial democracy, race is mixed there, and there's no animosity or any type of racial inequality. So to have someone like Nascimento go into a place that's a meeting for all of these, well-known Black people who are participating in the Nigerian Festival of Arts and Culture, this would rip the mask off the hidden face of Brazilian racism that the Brazilian government wanted to cover up. So his attempt to demonstrate, even with objective numbers, the process of annihilation of the identity of Black men and women by social economic mechanisms has marked many African intellectuals. In 1978, it was published in a book in Brazil entitled O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro, Processo de Racismo Mascarado, or again, The Genocide of the Black Brazilian, the process of a masked racism, becoming a symbol of the denunciation of racism and its cover-up by society, including unrestricted use of the word genocide, which still raises controversy. So Nascimento was one of the first, Black Brazilians to use the word genocide to define what was going on with Black Brazilians at the time and up till now, to tell you the truth. 40 years later, the book is being re-released by the Perspectiva publisher with prefaces by the sociologist Florestan Fernandes and the Nigerian well-known writer Wole Soyinka, present at the colloquium of 1977, as well as an afterword by Nascimento's widow, Elisa Larkin Nascimento. The republication of the text, she believes, brings the registration of a decisive moment in the evolution of the fight against racism in Brazil. Just to point out, Florestan Fernandes was a well-known sociologist that was one of the first Brazilian intellectuals to go deep into studying Brazilian racism. So at the same time that the Brazilian government is producing this idea that there's no racism, Florestan Fernandes, his work, anybody who's studying race in Brazil, you're going to study some of Florestan Fernandes's work. Very important titles that you can find. A lot of his work has been translated into English from the Portuguese, right? This is Nascimento with Florestan Fernandes. The book now reaches a public perhaps more prepared to receive its message, argues Elisa, who heads the Instituto IPEA, or IPEA Afro, founded by Nascimento. We have already gone through several phases of struggles and achievements in relation to public policies brought about by issues that Abdias brought out for the first time. Society has become sufficiently aware of the existence of racism to recognize the confrontation necessary to come to these policies. So what she's saying here is, with the re-release of this book, like almost 40 years later, or maybe exactly 40 years later, she's saying that this is a time that the Brazilian public is more apt to listen to this expose of Brazilian racism, because when this book came out in 1978, throughout the 70s, they were still in full denial, right? So Nascimento's work is something that's been studied and written about in academia for years. Okay, so this is Nascimento with the famous Nigerian writer, Wole Soyinka. Elisa Nascimento recalls that at the time, the use of the term genocide was seen as unusual and even aggressive by some. By curtailing Nascimento's official participation in the colloquium, the government tried to prevent his denunciation from reaching an international context. However, the explosive content of his text has gained enormous repercussions, partly thanks to the mobilization of Nigerian intellectuals. So what she's saying here is that Brazilian intellectuals took up Nascimento's, what he was talking about, even as the Brazilian government tried to, just like cut him off, mute his message, while the Nigerian intellectuals listened to what he was saying and took heed to what he was trying to expose about the struggle of Afro-Brazilians. Brazil used the image of the so-called racial democracy as an appeal to export products to African countries, says Elisa Nascimento. Abdias emphasized how this trade fueled by a lie benefited only a racist elite who discriminated against Blacks in degrading working conditions. So let me just follow up with some of these notes here. This is the blog's main article on Nascimento. So I have another article. I think I put that article out celebrating the 100th year of the birth of Abdias de Nascimento. But his importance can be seen throughout the blog, as a number of pieces either mention him or include other information about him. The second note, showing how ahead of his time he really was, Nascimento labeled Brazil's treatment of Afro-Brazilians as genocide 40 years ago, which was considered absurd by many at the time. Today, Afro-Brazilian activists use this term specifically when speaking of the rate in which Brazil murders Black Brazilian youth. So that's just a little introduction. I'm going to get more into Abdias de Nascimento, the person, the activist, the intellectual. But this is just a quick piece I wanted to put out about one of his most important books and how it was re-released some almost 40 years after it was originally released in 1978. So that's going to end this piece that, if there are books that, as I've said, if you read Portuguese, this is a book. I'm surprised this book hasn't been translated into English. And if it has, I'm not aware of it. But if it hasn't been translated into Portuguese yet, you have to wonder why, because this is another important book for people outside of Brazil who are curious about what's going on with the racial situation in Brazil. So anyway, I'm going to leave this here. Definitely consider subscribing to this channel. Give me a thumbs up for the video if you learned something, if this is information that you thought was important, in the context of the African diaspora. Do consider sharing this video. Push the notification button so you'll be one of the first people to get the video when it comes out, when it debuts. And with that said, I'm going to end this video here right now and invite you all to come and check out my next video.